right. So, hello, Steve. Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Yes, it has.
Um, Introductions are always awkward. I'm sorry, I'm bad with this thing.
No, that's fine.
I think I'm just gonna go straight to the first question.
Sure.
When Callum finds the crucified Malazan children, he thinks to himself, among other things, that he hopes that if he gets to succeed in his mission and remove Laseen, then whoever next takes the throne will be able to rule from a position other than a position of crisis. And this is one question and one confusion I've seen in a lot of people. They don't understand how is it that Laseen, being an empress and having so much power, could be in fact so helpless. So would you like to explain that position, particularly the way she finds herself in the Bone Hunters during the fight leaving Moxhold?
Well, systems are powerful in and of themselves. They have their own structure and their own sort of somewhat contained chaos. And it's very difficult for any particular individual, single individual, to affect change, no matter what their position of power. Some things acquire momentum on their own, and it can leave someone viewing the situation as having far fewer choices than you would think. And so, particularly with the case of Laseen, she's got powerful power blocks, if you will, that are caging her in a sense, and it's more a case of she's unable to affect changes to the scale that she wants to. There are too many things in the way. There are too many people. There are too many conflicted interests. There are all kinds of things that can lock a person up. So even the idea of sort of a single source of power, political power, is always suspect, and it's vulnerable. I mean, we're seeing examples of this right now. So I don't want to get into that subject matter at the moment, but and we can see how even somebody who is basically despotic in their position remains still vulnerable to larger forces, economic forces, forces of opinion, all of these things. So Kalam at that moment is obviously witnessing the uprising. So the rebellion is in place and atrocities are occurring. And so, it's kind of a forlorn hope on his part. But quite often, nations lurch from crisis to crisis. And that seems to be the nature of the beast when you're talking about civilization. So.
Okay. For the second question, this one was actually more of a philosophical answer, but I really, really liked it. In the ancient seven city, first empire city that Heboric and his team they discover, they find all of these dead bodies petrified, and Heboric, he starts having visions of these people and starts experiencing their yearnings and fears and dreams, and he's having a conversation with Felison about where does it all go, and he has this beautiful response which perhaps answers to the age-old question of why does evil happen? Why does God allow these things to happen? So it says that all the unseen energy of life's thoughts is food for the gods. This is why they must be fickle. It's a nice concept.
For the Malazan universe, where you have gods who are active and efficacious, there has to be a relationship between those gods and moral mortal beings. And so the question of what constitutes worship and what constitutes that, the nature of that relationship, is one that is explored throughout the series. I come back to it again and again. So it raises the question. I mean, I don't have specific answers to any of this stuff, but you know, through the various characters in the stories, I'll pose questions, and I mean they're genuine questions because I don't have the answers, but I guess for me, part of the exploration of fiction is to pose those questions. So.
And to look at potential answers, because this is one potential answer.
I don't remember specifically on the scene. I do know that that scene foreshadows Itkovian's response to the Talana Mass. So that whole idea of locked up histories and past that have been lost, and then opening the window onto those mindsets of people long gone. So
nice. There's something, I know, maybe a parallel I drew. For the people of the First Empire, becoming a soul taken in, or a diverse was the equivalent of a old technology rediscovered.
Mm.
And it makes me think of the way people today are so hung up on looking for old remedies and all sorts of stuff while rejecting traditional medicine. This dream that the old has some sort of mystery, some sort of power that we have now lost.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the equivalent of the magic equivalent of today's rejection of medicine, this embracing of the soul taken and diverse. Did you mean it like that?
No, I don't think so. Not directly. I think it's part of the human condition, that we hold to a yearning for something that has been lost, and we don't know what it is, but each of us feels it to varying degrees. And it's not just a question of nostalgia. I think there's something that runs a little bit deeper on this stuff. It's almost like a built-in yearning, but it's the very thing that sort of drives us forward as a species, as societies and as cultures. So as we're being driven forward by the system's own momentum, there's a tendency to look back and wonder what has been left behind, what has been missed, what has been rejected, and to see if there is value to be found in those things. So, like you say, there is a strong push, for example, for shamanic intercession when it comes to psychoses, physical ailments, that kind of thing. And basically what shamanic is approaching the problem as being a spiritual one. And so that's why the shamans are the ones that one seeks to intercede on their behalf. There's no telling how efficacious all that is, because I think we're a mysterious species, and that mystery is something that science cannot necessarily directly answer to at all. And so it's not surprising that there's a push away from the systems that are in place now, in search for something that might be equally useful or useful in a different way. So I'm not, it can be unfortunate when, this thing gets pushed into the political sphere of anti-vaxxing and all that kind of stuff. It just, that's kind of a misunderstanding of holistic approaches and alternative healing, energy healing, all that stuff. It's a misunderstanding of those things, because these things are to be seen as in addition to whatever else we've got in terms of treatments, rather than a substitution. The science is quite well known on vaccines, and even the vaccines that were brought up for COVID are not new things. The science is well understood on that stuff, and so to reject that stuff in favor of other things is, well, it's risky and probably misplaced. But anyways, so we venture into the political aspects and ideological aspects. It didn't take us long, did it? It didn't take me long. 8 minutes.
Even with this, I mean, when you say alternative medicine, depends what you're referring to, because one very famous cure here is like, I don't know the name of the condition in English, like one on your feet when the bones start to grow sideways.
Mm-hmm.
So when the bone starts to grow, the only way to treat it is surgical.
Mm-hmm.
The cure says that you can just wrap leaves of pickled cabbage and the bone swell is going to disappear on its own.
Wow. And does that work?
Of course it doesn't. But there are many people who believe this sort of stuff. So
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that derives from what's now considered esoteric knowledge of things in the natural environment that can be used for medicinal purposes. And there's nothing irrational about that, because there are a lot of our sort of best medicines originally came from plant extracts. So it's not that unusual to think. So in this case, I'm not sure where what the origins are of this. But one would think if it's not efficacious, then there's some other reason for why it's being persistently held onto as a belief system, and that's a whole different area. So that's, yeah.
One is mistrust of the medical system.
Sure, absolutely. And when the medical system is bound in with the tenets of capitalism, mistrust is well founded. So yeah, I mean, when money's involved, people have to be leery, of various claims and all the rest. But at the same time, if the science is well known, you have to accept the science. It's there, it's right there in front of you. And you can be annoyed at the fact of, pharmaceutical companies charging a fortune for insulin and this kind of thing. But that is not to take away the necessity of insulin, if you see what I mean. They're two different things.
Well, with us, it's not so much an issue of money as it is an issue of inherited post-communist awful bedside manner. People are afraid of doctors. They hate doctors because they're
really
often badly behaved.
Mm-hmm.
They're rude. On the other side, a lot of the population is incredibly undereducated. I mean, 40% of Romania's population still believes that the sun revolves around the earth.
Mm.
So it's difficult to deal with people who constantly challenge your knowledge while they know nothing.
Mm.
Weird balance, but it has consequences.
Well, people will protect their worldview, right? And anything that threatens it, they will oppose. I mean, that's human nature. So.
Okay. While exploring the ancient city, Heboric explains that the first empire people, they used to have powerful alchemies that kept them from aging, 6 or 7 centuries of life for everyone. Now, this made me think of Kelor's alchemies, and clearly Kelor's are a lot more potent, or at least used more often. But it does point to the fact that even if ascension wasn't possible for all, they still lived a very long life. And that in turn makes me wonder of how long did the average Theist live, one that is not an Elaine soul taken?
It's a good question. I've never really asked that of myself either. So I can't really give you an answer. They live as long as is necessary for the story. So
the books have different informations in different places, and people have been asking that a lot because there's conflicting information.
Yeah.
Of it. That explains it.
But the Tice are also imbued with magic. They are magic users, and I think one of the sort of unspoken rules that Cam and I would probably operate under, especially in the gaming and stuff, is that magic itself conveys longevity in some fashion or another. So they will be long-lived for sure, which then poses other questions of the psychological effect on being around for as long as they are, and that becomes an interesting question in and of itself. So,
well, that, and also how it affects their physique and their development and their social habits. For example, the Taist Edur, they get married at a late age, at least the males, they don't feel the need to start their sexual life. So if you're a young man at the age of 80,
yeah, you're a bit more laconic in your approach to these things, that's for sure. A bit more measured, I would think. It's just other things to explore in terms of characters, and it's just extrapolating sort of from our own human condition. There's a great song by Canadian performer named Bruce Coburn, and the song's called "Pacing the Cage," and I think he wrote it probably in his early 70s maybe, and it's basically about just sort of the weariness of his life's battle with the injustices of the world through his music. And so if you can imagine that, within a 70-year lifespan, then, try to imagine it within a 100,000-year lifespan. It will have an effect on the basic psychology of the personality. And that's, for me, interesting to explore.
well, the Tlanimas don't even think of futility, so.
Well, they were a special case, right? They had their lives expunged, so even their memories, at least until the end of Memories of Ice.
And just these days, I was talking to somebody about the link between that first dialogue of Tool meeting Adjunct Lorne, what he thinks of his futility, and then she says, "Do all Tlanimas think of futility?" And he just laconically says, "No." And then she pushes, "What do they think about?" "They think about nothing." Says, "Why?" "Because that would be futile."
Yeah.
And then later on in Deadhouse Gates, that same link is made with Felicin thinking of futility, Heborg thinking how their flight through the desert is futile, Fiddler in the whirlwind chased by the Graal warriors, he thinks how futile everything is. And I remember thinking, this has to do with Atlanimas. I don't know how, but it has to do with them.
Well, it's a theme that was going to be explored, and I was going to put the focus with respect to that theme on the Tlanimas. And the entire title of the third book is referring to these memories frozen and locked away, and so that was going to be pretty essential. So I probably was aware of that enough in writing Deadhouse Gates to start sort of setting the table for the third book. So
I remember at the end of House of Chains, when I realized who Drishna was, it really felt like I had won a trophy. Like I knew it. I mean, even Sheikh says at some point that the whirlwind is so scouring that not even Atlanimas could pass through that barrier, which makes sense. She would want to protect herself from her own kind.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Also on the topic of alchemies, Duiker mentions that he received alchemies from Kellenved and that they are the reason why he's still hanging around. And I know a lot of people are asking, based on how much these people have lived, how old is the empire? And then there's that tricky little note in the Path to Ascendancy where they say that they made a mistake in recording the age of the empire based on Kellenved's age. Nonetheless, these people really did live this long because Duiker confirms it. So it's a little confirming. I mean, it's not important, it's not essential to know how long the empire is, but maybe how long Duiker and the Whiskey Jack and the rest of the crew, that would be interesting to know.
Well, I'll leave most of that up to Cam. I know he described to me that scene that you're mentioning, and we both. I mean, I just laughed my head off. I thought it was hilarious, and so I was waiting for that to show up, because that was kind of the answer to the timeline issues that so many fans had. It was, basically a case of Kellenved just making shit up as he goes along, and I just thought that was great.
Yeah, it was. Actually, those 3 books are great. They're phenomenal and funny. For my next question, I'd like to share the screen and show you a bit of a text. It's easier that way. Okay.
Okay.
They're still in the First Empire City. They're talking about the battle that Tlanimas had with the Soul Taken and the Verse. And says they took losses here. Oh, that they did, Heboric said. Appalling losses. There is a bond between the Tlanimas and the Soul Taken and the Verse, a mysterious kinship that was unsuspected by the dwellers of the city, though they claimed for themselves the proud title of First Empire. That would have irritated the Tlanimas, assuming such creatures can feel irritation, to have so boldly assumed the title that rightly belonged to them. Yet what drew them here was the ritual and the need to set things right. Culp was frowning behind the battered mask of his features. Our brushes with the Soul Taken and the Mass. What's beginning again, Heboric? I don't know, mage. A return to that ancient gate? Another unleashing? That Soul Taken dragon we followed. It was undead. It was Tlanimas, the ex-priest elaborated. A bone caster. Perhaps it is the old gate's custodian, drawn once again in answer to an impending calamity. Shall we move on? Well, that's not important anymore. But the unleashing and the ritual, these really caught my attention. During my first read, I had understood it that people who became Soul Taken and diverse in the First Empire, they did it willingly. Then I realized that actually it wasn't willing. A magic was unleashed, and everybody was subjected to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the event that the diverse and Soul Taken in the Deadhouse Gates timeline would have reached Tremolor and took the throne, is that what they were planning? Another unleashing of this magic?
I'm not sure. It's been so long since I was even thinking in terms of the backstory to this kind of stuff. But from what I recall, the Tlanimas showed up at the First Empire and slapped it down. For a variety of reasons, but I mean, quite often for the Tlanimas, they don't really need reasons to do whatever they do; they just do it. Obviously the undead bone caster is Olar Thiel, and I suppose some aspects. I'm writing a fair bit of Olar Thiel's point of view actually right now in Walk in Shadow. So she has what appears to be a fairly major role. So some of that stuff may be touched on and answered in that respect, in terms of the gate that Olar Thiel is associated with in some fashion. I suspect that will come up. But for specifics, it's pretty hard for me to recall, to be honest.
I was just about to ask that if she's Azathanai, but we know the dragons usually guard the gates. She does take the shape of a dragon, but she's not Elaine. But they suggest that she's the keeper of the path of hens, and that's another thing that I think I just got cleared up right now. There are two paths of hens. One is the fake actual path of hens that
This girl.
this girl puts through the desert. The other one is the actual name of the warren, like you would say Corel Galen, only you call it Path of Hens. That's something you never.
Say that again. The other one is the actual Path of Hens. Yes.
But it's an actual warren, like any other of the elder warrens.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
It's probably thinking on it, it's probably originally a hold rather than a house. And it probably never had any kind of internal organization to it. It's far more a kind of a physical force that's capable of afflicting itself upon people and upon individuals, and then shaping those cultures, like the Jek, for example, the Jellic. But I don't think that we ever had, well, it's kind of touched on that there's a kind of a throne involved that may be related to the beast throne. I don't remember, but I suspect that's the case.
That's what the scene implies, that there's a relationship, a kinship between the soul taken and diverse and the Tlani Mass. And I was wondering, how are they related through the beast hold, because the flesh and bloody mass used to worship the beast hold.
Yeah,
so that would connect them.
Yeah, that seems fair.
Well, that's actually a pretty big question. It's a confusing one because according to the Malazan wiki, Fener sits on the throne of the beast hold. But I always thought of the beast hold like more of a hold of nature, not hold of war as magic aspects.
Yeah, it's definitely been misinterpreted for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's good to know, because I was thinking, I mean, we all know from the Karkanis books that the Imas, the flesh and blood Imas, worship both Olarethil's fire and the beast hold and nature in general, of which fire is a part of.
Yeah, but burn as well. Yeah, and so they have an unusual relationship with Olarethil for sure, and I'm definitely exploring that right now in Walk in Shadow. Yeah.
And the nature of the warren of Telan, while traveling through it, sometimes it's a tundra, sometimes it's a swamp, but sometimes it's just a combination of fire and sand. So
yeah,
that's another.
Well, yeah, it's how it's going to appear is quite often aspected to the person pushing their way into it. So the environment will vary. It will shift. It will be what it needs to be for the scene, based on the character. I mean, it's funny because quite often, or well, early on, in anthropology and archaeology, paleoanthropology, I guess people envisioned the Neanderthal as being tundra dwellers, cold dwellers, when in fact they actually suffered greatly when the ice ages hit. And they were more probably forest dwellers than they were on the tundra, because they're primarily ambush hunters, it appears. So, my earliest conceptions of the Tlana Mass and their culture quite often place them on the tundra. And but as knowledge has improved and more evidence is coming to light, then I'm going to have to, and I have been sort of expanding the environment for the Tlana Mass, or for the Mass rather, which is not to say that populations cannot be pushed into inhospitable environments like tundras, because that's certainly the case. And that's not just the case for the Neanderthal, it's the case for human populations as well. And then they adapt, and that's interesting, the ways in which they adapt. So.
That actually makes sense, because the Warren would be part of all the lands they lived in. Since they no longer live, it's part of their memory, and different tribes lived in different areas. So whoever opens the Warren and travels through it can choose how to represent it.
Yeah, and I think, even in sort of general knowledge and thinking about Neanderthals, by sort of the lay public, there's a misconception that they are, almost exclusively northern style peoples, peoples of the cold environments, and exclusively European, when they weren't. Some of the best Neanderthal sites are in Israel, and in that region. And then you've got Gibraltar and places like that. So Neanderthals were perfectly content in nice temperate or even subtropical environments. And yet, the common conception is, wrapped up in furs in a cave somewhere in Germany, or what is now Germany. But they were far more adaptable than that. So, and so that, that kind of stuff always informs part of the world building in terms of their cultures and that kind of thing. Which, curiously, I thought I had kind of left that story behind, the story of the Amass, and then started writing God Is Not Willing, and lo and behold, the Amass show up. So it was unexpected, but obviously I'm not done with that story.
Now I have a hot one. This is something that has been on my mind for a really long while now. I mean, years on my mind. The way that people treat art and the artistic product in the end, the same way they would treat any other commodity, the way they would, I don't know, I don't like the owner of this business, I'm not going to buy his merchandise. I don't like this author, I'm not going to buy his book. And they look at art as an economical product, as a means to affect change, economic change, financial change, and not, they ignore the thing in front of them in favor of the purpose behind the thing. And I was thinking that this is perhaps new, it's specific to our age, and then I thought a little back, and actually not. I mean, okay, today people have more options in terms of publishing, of bringing themselves out there.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, for example, of Mozart's story, who had the Bishop of Esterhazy as a patron for so long, and then they had a fight, and he basically drove him out of business.
Mm-hmm.
So this attitude of looking at art as consumable has been there since before, and I was basically considering the ups and downs, the morality of it. Sometimes it seems hypocritical. I mean, you read the book for the book, not for the man who wrote it, or I don't know, buy the apples for the apples, not for the farmer who grew them. You go to the shop because it's convenient, not because you like the owner.
Yeah, well, there are two very different things I think you're talking about there. One, you've got produce, okay? So you're talking about apples, that kind of thing. And within the economic sphere, there's an amorality attached to that. That's only occasionally impinged upon. So, for example, the idea of blood diamonds. So that there's an ethical stain upon the product, and that people will oppose that, and that's that's a perfectly understandable and reasonable and, to my mind, legitimate response to these things. You know, if the person with the the cart full of apples, um, got those apples from, you know, from an orchard owned by somebody that, you know, they went in and killed and, you know, collected up all the apples, one might reasonably have, if you know about it, some objection to buying those apples. Now, the thing with, but that's again, that's material produce. So it's something that its value is in and of itself. So nutritional, whatever. With art, it's a completely different scenario. Art has always had an uneasy relationship with economics and the economic system of any complex state, or well, probably at state level, kind of civilization. It's always had a very, very strained relationship. And sometimes, well, because of necessity, most artists, at least in the last 300 years in the West, have been dependent upon that system. And that can have an effect on the product being produced, or whether it's a product that reaches the public attention or not. So it's always been, you know, it's, you can think of systems where you would have a court jester, for example, where in a sense they take on the role of the artist as almost caricature, in order to do the thing that art always does, which is to comment on the human condition at any given time. And that sort of gave the rules and the arena for potentially volatile political commentary or social critique. And then you go back a little bit further and you're looking at bards and minstrels. And what they're doing is they are traveling through an economic system, living as best they can based on their talents and skills, while busily, quite often, subverting everything around them. And that is also, I think, an instinct for artists, whether it's music or poetry or paintings, you name it. If you're awakened to the subversive elements of these things, you can't help but see them almost everywhere. So this is what artists do. They have, for good and ill, a sense of being on the outside looking in, almost wherever they are. And that establishes a kind of objectivity, or at least a perspective that's potentially objective. And through their art, they communicate their thoughts on those, on what they witness. And that can be extremely dangerous. And it can certainly be viewed as dangerous by the system that is in power, in place, economically, politically, whatever. I mean, there was a good reason for example, jazz being the subject of oppression in the Czech Republic after the occupation and the enfolding into the Soviet Union, because jazz, of its nature, is subversive. That's what it is, and it was recognized as potentially a threat. There's a writer named Joseph Skorecki, I think his name was, a jazz musician who fled the Czech Republic at the occupation just before, and lived in Canada and wrote some really, really good books. And yeah, a lot of his books are about jazz in Prague, leading up to the country's occupation. And it's pretty fascinating stuff, for sure. So, I mean, art is it's recognized as potentially a threat to any kind of system in terms of controlling the population, because it is by its nature a subversive means of communication. Because on the one hand, it's there to entertain and engage and occupy and distract the population. But it's never just that. There's always other stuff going on under the surface. And that's what makes it potentially politically dangerous. So artists are really, yeah, we're kind of, dancing with the devil, because we have to make a living. So there's definitely a kind of a pressure to provide works that are entertaining, that engage people. But at least for me, I always have to acknowledge that there's always more going on in what I'm doing. So, and that can disaffect viewers, disaffect readers, disaffect the audience. And they may not pick up on specifically what I'm up to, but they may pick up subconsciously on what I'm up to and get pissed off. And that's fair enough. That's part of the engagement that an artist who produces work for public consumption has to accept, that it's always an uneasy conversation. And most artists would tell you they want it to be an uneasy conversation. They prefer it, they feed on it. Anyways, that's a long answer for it. And it's not even an answer, it's just an observation. But
I've noticed this ever increasing social tendency, because it's not something that comes from politics. It's not something imposed by the system. It's this social tendency to treat art more and more as if it was produce.
mm-hmm.
And I find that somewhat disturbing, and I find it hypocritical, because it is applied where it's comfortable, but not everywhere. I mean, when you're rushed to the ER, you don't say, hey, I don't want the operation unless I do a checkup of the doctor to see if he's morally acceptable. So when it's comfortable, you apply the principle. And when it's not, you don't even think of it. It's hypocritical, especially as it relates to art, which is not produce. It shouldn't be treated like that.
Well, sure, but a global culture, if you will, a modernized global culture, is being pushed in every direction to engage with virtually everything as commodity, which then places you in the position of customer. So this is what's hitting universities, for example, where students are no longer students, they're now customers. And
hospitals,
the relationship between a customer and one providing the services is entirely different from a relationship between a student and a faculty. And so it then sort of encourages a renewed sense of, I guess, entitlement, because the whole idea of the customer always being right is sort of a linchpin of our modern capitalistic system. So it's not surprising that sort of bleeds outward into everything that a person is, quote unquote, consuming. And some artists are far better at managing that kind of stuff than others. So it's hit and miss. And all of that's going to be sort of up front in terms of, as you say, the public dialogue, the public engagement, the ethosphere, the whole thing. And to what extent the artist is going to address that in their work is entirely up to the artist. So, it's not a question of not being aware of it. It's a question of, how do I navigate this? And, it varies. So
I stick to my opinion. It's disturbing. I don't like it.
well, yeah, but I mean, to me, it adds another challenge to the storytelling process, to the artistic process. And that challenge is, what can I get away with in terms of subverting and subconsciously planting seeds in the audience, whether it finds fertile ground or not. It just becomes another challenge. And I welcome those kind of challenges. They're the things that fascinate me. And it's all about communications, about and that's at the core of all art. And why not engage with it and grapple with it, no matter what its nature at any one time. You can't run from it. I mean, the equivalent of that would just be to stop producing art and to slip into the background. So,
Well, your position as an artist, it's different from mine, who just, I'm here and I get the goods. So the way we
yeah,
see it is a little different.
yeah. But I mean, AP Kahneman talks about colonizing the imagination, which is, to me, is just I don't know if it's his phrase, but it's a very evocative, lovely description of what art does, and why you get such visceral responses when somebody like a showrunner or somebody buying the rights and adapting some work of art then produces that thing where you get sort of a visual impact, which in effect colonizes the imagination for that particular work. So if people think of Frodo now, well, who do they see, right? The film has produced, has planted in the audience a very, very specific actor and very specific role, and that's that. And so when an adaptation happens, and the character or the actor chosen for a particular beloved character in a book doesn't match the internal image, the internal mental image of that character, then you can quite often get a very instant visceral response of rejecting it, critiquing it, criticizing it, hating it, et cetera, et cetera.
Guilty as charged.
Well, but again, it's human nature. And I think, the idea of colonizing the imagination is very apt in everything that's implied by that. Sometimes it's not necessarily voluntary, right? A reader reads something and they will create a mental scene, an internal scene and series of scenes. And those scenes are guided by what's on the page, but not exclusively so, because the reader brings their own imagination to it and their own visualizations. And that's just the way it is. And, in a sense, one would not want to have it any other way, because you're trying to engage the imagination of the audience, of your readers. And so it can be understandable that, when somebody else comes and populates that world through adaptation, that you can feel ungrounded. You can feel sort of like, you're on uncertain ground with what you're seeing. And so people can reject it on that basis. But, I mean, one would hope that, every adaptations will have their own virtues, their own qualities, things that they can bring to written text that a book just can't. And I think maybe there's a sense where that's not being valued enough at the moment, so that people are so busy comparing with their internal sense of that work of art or series or whatever, that they're not seeing or valuing what's in front of them. So,
which brings me for the last question, but might take a while. I think that there's a difference between art containing a moral message and being linked to the social and political state of the moment where that particular art is created, and art used as a tool by establishment to promote certain ideas, to even propaganda. Like, how do you see the difference between the two? How do you limit them whenever you look at a movie or read a book, or I don't know, hear a song? How do you limit the difference between what's proper link between art and the political social status, and a message that carries, and a message that is used by the system to promote themselves and in defense of themselves?
right. Well, we got bumped off there, did we?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. All art has a built-in ethos of some form or another. And that will exist whether the producer of that art is conscious of it or not. It's just there. It's part of our cultural baggage. And so, I sort of recoil a little bit at the notion of a moral message, because in that sense, the notion of a moral message applies to both propaganda and to any other form of art. You can't have one without the other. So that's why I'm thinking more in terms of an ethos, and you can sort of parse that down to ideology or worldview or that kind of thing, but not necessarily. And yes, it's always going to be a product of its time, whatever is produced. But I don't necessarily see a huge problem with that. The idea of sort of creating a dichotomy whereby you've got art on one side, which is counterculture, and art on the other side, the propagandistic stuff, which is an effort to reaffirm the status quo. And that, to me, would be the only kind of separation between the two, is that, if you look at stuff and all the stuff you're looking at, and ask yourself, well, what themes and what things are being explored here, and then ask yourself, do these things reaffirm the status quo, or do they challenge the status quo? And then you can decide from there. I mean, if you are in favor of the status quo, then you'll fall on one side of what you like. And if you are in favor of challenging the status quo, recognizing various injustices and past crimes and all the rest, then you fall on the other side. But even the value-laden terminology you're using of propaganda, for example, state-controlled art.
Like, for example, you were speaking at some point against not maybe against, but maybe criticizing the superhero movies and the way that the men in black, the in suits, they're always there to solve the problem and all that. It's this reinforcement that the organizations of the state, even the secret organizations of the state, are the good guys, and it's okay to let them take everything away from you and do what they have to do because they're the good guys. So that's one example. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily propaganda. I'm not. I can't find a better word.
No, I think status quo can sort of be the umbrella for that, because it implies what what you're describing there is established mechanisms of authority, and of course, what's implicit there is the recourse to violence in order to maintain that authority. So, yes, for me, I mean, once you start seeing, especially very popular films, in that light, you can't help but see it everywhere, right? It's very much superhero films to a large extent, maybe less so now, but they were delivering some pretty dubious messages, and very much in reaffirmation of the status quo. And so nowadays, of course, a lot of the comic book stuff adaptations are deconstructing themselves, and so that's gotten much more interesting, and sort of revealing some of the massive I guess ethical black holes that's present in a lot of these universes, these fictional universes, comic book universes. And so that's really interesting. But it's more a case of, as an audience, whether you want to choose to, rather, I mean, you can just be passively entertained by something and then walk away from it, and, it has no other impact upon you, at least not consciously. Or you can challenge them, and try to sort of figure out what's the bigger picture, that may be deliberately or not deliberately conveyed by whatever it is you're watching. And that, to me, is just more of I do that for entertainment. It's fun to actually see what the subtext is on these things. But sometimes it's not just fun. The conclusion you come to is appalling and kind of frightening. And it's just the nature of the industry now. Is it may be still sort of geared towards a particular mindset in its audience. But primarily, I don't think it's doing it for evil reasons. I think it's doing it for monetary reasons, to maximize profit. That's the driving force. And so the question then is, to what extent is everything we're seeing on screen a reaction to what is perceived as the general sensibilities of the population, of the majority of people, versus Hollywood somehow being the guiding voice of ethics and attitudes and ideologies, which I don't think is the case, because I think what's driving Hollywood is the necessity and hunger for profit. And so they will always be reactionary, almost always, except for independent films and stuff. But so yeah, it's people can think of it as being sort of the liberal left, Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. But if they're liberal left, they're only responding to what they perceive as the majority of the population in terms of their products. So you're pointing the finger at the wrong thing, right? Filmmaking and television, it's a reactive beast. That's all it is. And it will react to the environment and produce stuff that's best suited to making money in that environment. So, but yeah, you're right. It easily becomes targets for everything.
One of the reasons I was asking is because, at least around me in my circle of acquaintances, most people aren't even aware of these messages. They don't even perceive the subtext. And if you don't challenge, if you're not aware of what's being told to you, then the way you assimilate that information is very different.
Well, maybe not as pernicious as it can sometimes seem. I mean, we are thinking individuals, and when something becomes immediate and personal, we make decisions accordingly. And when in the abstract, which is what all of film and television and art actually is for most of the audience, it's in the abstract. Does not necessarily convey the belief systems of the audience at all. So it's that idea of love. You go to a film and there's people who just absolutely love all the violence and all the gunfire and all the explosions and all the rest. It's not to say that they would love that in their lives, because they wouldn't, right? It's horrific. It means suffering, it means fear, it means all these things. So humans are quite capable of encapsulating and enclosing those kinds of visceral experiences, those experiences that are once removed and kind of outside our personal experiences. I think it's too easy to conflate the two, to think that the love of violence in film or whatever is in some way corrupting an audience into loving violence. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
I wouldn't think that either. People love it in movies because they know that nobody gets hurt.
Yeah.
They enjoy the fun, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah. I think we're thinking species, and I think we have to give ourselves more credit than sometimes some of the general attitudes and reactions to this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, the hour has expired.
Okay.
This was fun. I'm not gonna retain you any longer.
Yeah, it was fun.
All right, and I'm going to have to say goodbye to
Yep.
everyone first. All right, see you.